Chapter 7. The riders came over the ridge at breakneck speed, spread out in a line, their rein slickers billowing out behind them. The horses' hooves thundered in the early morning air, though somewhat muted by the sloshing water-soaked sod as the iron shoes slipped in the wet grass. Low-hanging dark rain clouds hugged the horizon, still gray with the coming dawn and tinged with only a hint of red misting above the distant mountains. King Royal, Harka, Johnny, and Luke rode in the center of the formation with 3 riders on either side of them. Water still dripped from the brims of their broad range hats, but the rain had finally subsided to just a cold drizzle. It had still been dark and rain was pouring hard when Archie Bannon had ridden into the Royal Crown front yard, firing his 6-shooter into the air in an effort to wake everyone at the ranch who were still recuperating from the late party the night before. He had a gash across his left shoulder, and blood had caked his torn shirt and skin. Because of the party, there had been fewer nighthawks on guard with the herd. Rustlers had taken advantage and hit them hard. 2 men had been killed, and about 100 head, mostly unbranded, had been run off. Since Arch would need his wound attended to, but still able to ride, he was the logical choice to send for help. The 3 remaining waddies stayed behind to guard the remainder of the herd. As King and his crew hurried to saddle up, King had tossed a pistol and holster toward Johnny. "You're going to need this, son," he said, as he hurried out into the yard, leaving Johnny standing there in the living room, hefting the weapon. By the time the riders rode into the big valley where the herd was being held, a patch of sun was starting to peek through the clouds, and a hint of gray-blue outlined the clouds as they drifted apart. The rain had completely stopped now, but the grass was still soggy as the horses were pulled to a halt. The wranglers wasted no time in filling King in on what had happened. Just before the rain started, while the night was still black, they had been hit by a half-dozen riders. Shorty and Slim had been downed immediately before anyone knew what was happening. Then, while 3 riflemen kept the rest of the Nighthawks pinned down, the others cut out the cattle that had been culled out for branding. As fast as the rustlers had appeared, they disappeared just as quickly into the night, heading north. King left 4 of his riders with the herd, while Harka scouted the area, picking up what tracks he could. The heavy rains had washed out much of their trail, but knowing the direction the outlaws had taken and Harka's ability at tracking, it wasn't long before they were back on the trail. They had, by now, doffed their bulky slickers and rode hard and fast. But as the sky cleared and the sun came out, the ground before them dried up, and soon the trail seemed to be disappearing as they rode into higher country, covered with shale and rocks. At times, the trail would be all but invisible, but Harka managed to find it again. As they rode on down rock-covered slopes, the trail emptied into a shallow creek bed. The trail did not emerge from the other side, so the cattle had to have been driven up or down the stream. The party separated with Johnny and Harka and Luke riding downstream, while the others rode upstream. Luke had been quiet all morning and sat the saddle sullenly. Every time Johnny glanced his way, Luke just seemed to glare at him. That is, if King were not around to see it. The events of the night before still gnawed at him. He kept dwelling on the fact that Johnny was taking over what rightfully belonged to him. His anger was so deep, he didn't seem to notice that King was still in full command this morning. Nothing had really changed, except for the speech King had made the night before. Johnny, realizing that without King along, Luke might want to make a play, so he casually assumed a trailing distance, keeping Harka between them. The stream bed widened, and the banks became more and more rocky as they traveled on. If the cattle had come this way, and had been driven out onto the rocky ground, it was going to be hard tracking. So far, there had been no sign of an emerging herd. A shot sounded upstream, then 2 more, and then a volley. Harka wheeled his big paint horse and shoved him forward upstream, water splashing high above his hocks, as he slipped and slid on the rocky bottom of the stream. Johnny was right behind him, but the spirited black shied at the turbulence and rough going. Johnny had to fight to bring him under control, and Harka soon outdistanced him. Shots were still echoing in the hills as Johnny followed where Harka had ridden out of the stream, onto a muddy bank and disappeared over a ridge. Cattle tracks and the tracks of several horses covered the grassy slope. A plume of smoke drifted into the sky above the outline of the ridge. He urged the black forward up the slippery slope. Its hoofs slipped, and it was an effort for the horse to make the climb. Just as they made it to the top of the bank, a shot rang out from behind him. Lead drilled into the bark of an aspen tree trunk just above his head, splinters flying into his face. Instinct threw him sidelong from the saddle, and he fell hard onto sod and rolled into a half-sitting position with his back against a rock. The horse skittered away over the ridge. His pistol was already in hand, and his eyes scanned the trail below. He saw no one, not even Luke. Where the hell had he disappeared to? In his rush to follow Harka, he had forgotten about Luke. Somehow, it didn't seem possible that Luke would have been so blatant as to attempt to kill him this way, but he had learned a long time ago not to underestimate anyone. Keeping his eye on the back trail, 6 guns still in hand, Johnny pushed himself to his feet and ran on up the slope. By now, the firing on the other side of the ridge had stopped. Whoever had fired at him from behind had probably used the shooting to cover his own shot, and chances are he would not fire again. As Johnny topped the ridge, he slid to a sudden halt. His face turned grim at the sight before him. A branding fire had been built in the clearing below. Several cattle, but a number far from the 100, milled about, and a calf, its feet tied with pigging strings, lay near the fire. 2 men had been placed on horses beneath a cottonwood tree, their hands tied behind their backs. Ropes dangled from branches above, and slip nooses were looped around the prisoners' necks. Both men were wounded and sat slumped in the saddle. Johnny recognized the one man as one of Darrow's men he had seen at the party the night before. He had a gaping leg wound, and blood dripped onto the grass beneath his horse. The other man, with a shoulder wound, he knew right off. He was Danny Corday. King stood next to Corday's mount, a coil of rope in his hand. His face was stone cold, and his eyes burned with fire. Harka stood back a step, and 2 of King's men held the prisoners' horses in check. Danny Corday's shoulders shook violently as he sobbed, begging King Royal not to do this. And then, with sudden swiftness, it was over. Before Johnny could gather himself together and raise his voice in protest, it was already too late. King had swung the coiled rope against the rump of Danny's horse as the man holding him released his grasp. The horse ran on, with the rope pulling the young man from the saddle with a violent jerk. His body fell, dangling in midair and swinging back in an arc. In the same instant, King had whipped the other horse, and Darrow's man flew out of the saddle. Johnny could hardly believe his eyes. The brutality of it all. The 2 men swung back and forth, bumping into each other, and once or twice into the tree trunk. Groans and gasps emerged from thick, swollen lips as the slip nooses strangled them. Their bodies jerked spasmodically, and their feet kicked wildly at first, and then becoming a twitch as the 2 men finally died, hanging limply, the ropes creaking against the branches as they swung slightly in the early morning breeze. King was still standing there, admiring his handiwork, when Johnny finally pulled himself together, gathered up his horse, that had drifted halfway down the slope, and advanced to the valley below. Harka eyed him keenly as he approached, but King ignored him, completely oblivious to the rage in Johnny's eyes. "Aren't you going to cut them down?" Johnny said coldly, not even trying to hold back the anger in his voice. King turned toward him slowly. He saw the anger in Johnny's eyes, but he didn't care. After all, he was King Royal, and he had meted out justice. He had nothing to be sorry for. "Not my job," he said flatly. "I've done mine." From the top of the ridge, Luke Thorne peered out from behind a tree, his face white with shock at the scene below. "Now you've really done it, old man," he thought to himself. Chapter 8. Sam Corday's ranch house was really nothing more than an oversized shack. Everything about it needed repair. The siding hadn't seen a stroke of paint in years, and what was left were flaking chips of undeterminable color. The roof was a patchwork of mismatched tiles, and where it overhung the dilapidated porch, it looked like the drooping brim of a battered hat. The outbuildings were in similar disrepair. The ramshackle barn and corral needed repair, and chickens and pigs roamed about the barnyard, no longer contained by adequate fencing. Johnny and King had been riding about a half hour, and the sun was now high in the sky. The early chill of morning was now completely gone. The warmth of the sun was now rising to near sweltering. Both men had remained silent as they rode on to Corday's Wishbone Ranch. Johnny was still angry, and held his mount just behind the old man and to his right. King didn't bother to elicit conversation from the young man. He knew Johnny was angry, but he didn't care. The young whelp would just have to get over it. If he were to follow in King's footsteps, he would have to get a whole lot tougher. And King knew he would. They had left Harka and the other riders behind to trail after the remainder of the stolen herd and had ridden on to Corday's land. King felt it was his duty to advise Sam Corday where he could find his son, but for some strange reason, Johnny could not understand why he did not find it necessary to tell Harvey Darrow about his man. Corday stepped out onto the plank-board porch as the two riders pulled their mounts to a halt in front of him. He was still wearing the same clothes he had the night before. Sam squinted up at them, the sun shining directly in his eyes. "Howdy, King," Corday greeted. "I didn't expect to see you again so soon. What brings you up this way?" "I'm afraid I have bad news for you, Sam," Royal said with a sincere tone of regret. Johnny could hardly believe his ears. This man was one crazy piece of work. "It's Danny. There's no easy way to say it, so I'll tell it straight out. He's dead." Corday's face went grim. His mouth gaped open. "He's down at the wash near Stony Creek," King continued, "hanging from a cottonwood tree along with one of Darrow's men. You'd better get down there and cut him down." What? Corday muttered almost beneath his breath, stunned and shocked. His eyes grew distant, and he stared at the board planking beneath his feet for a moment. Then, suddenly he raised his head, eyes glaring, his face a mask of rage. "Just what happened out there, Mr. Royal?" Suspicion in his raspy voice. "They were caught red-handed, rustling my stock. Killed two of my boys. I had no choice but to hang them," King stated matter-of-factly. Johnny gritted his teeth at the sheer meanness of it all. Sure, Corday growled. "I wouldn't sell out to you last night, and today you kill my boy." "I wish you wouldn't look at it like that, Sam." Danny stepped over the line. "You know what happens to rustlers. I would have done the same, no matter who it was. I really am sorry it was Danny." "You hypocrite," Johnny thought. "You do understand, don't you, Sam?" There was pleading in King Royal's voice. The rage seemed to drain from Corday's face, and his lips began to quiver. A tear welled in his eye. He staggered a bit on his feet, then braced himself against the porch upright post. His voice went back to a mutter. "Hold on a minute, King," he said. "I'll be right back." He turned and staggered through the doorway into the shack. King glanced at Johnny, a slight smile of satisfaction on his face. The smile faded quickly as Sam Corday burst through the doorway, an old, long, double-barreled shotgun in his massive hands. He was earing back the hammers as he came and shouting obscenities. Larry and Millie were right behind him. King, surprised and caught completely off guard, jerked at the reins. His horse shied back a step and half-reared, half enclosed in close quarters by the hitch rail to the front and Johnny's horse to the right. Johnny had not been caught off guard at all. In fact, he had expected some sort of retaliation and instinctively lurched out the saddle, throwing himself sideways through the air and slamming into Corday, gripping the shotgun with both hands and twisting it from Sam's grasp. The old man and Johnny landed on the planking just as one barrel fired off, ripping a giant hole in the drooping overhang. The weapon fell free and thudded onto the floor. Splinters and rotted debris showered down on top of them. Johnny, rolling over and recovering, could see King still bringing his mount under control. His own horse had already skittered away. "Get out of here!" Johnny shouted to King Royal. Royal seemed stunned at the command. "Get out of range, now, or I'll shoot you myself." Finally recognizing his plight, King Royal twisted his mount around and rode off. Johnny rolled to all fours and was pushing himself to his feet when, like a blur, he saw Larry's one good arm reaching for the shotgun. He dove forward and snatched the weapon away just in time, and rising to one knee, he swung the wooden stock into Larry's midsection. Larry groaned with pain, doubled up, and fell to the planking next to his father. As Johnny stood up, Millie threw herself against him, pounding his chest with both hands and screaming at him, her face a mass of tears. He took the beating as he held the shotgun high and released the other barrel, then tossed the gun away from the porch into the dirt. Now, with his hand free, he grasped her by both arms and shook her free of him, holding her at arm's length. "You Royals are all alike, aren't you?" she shouted. "Brutal animals. You beat up on an old man and a cripple. You gonna beat me up now? Go ahead, what's stopping you?" She seemed to have given up now. No more fight, just sobbing. "Millie, he gazed into her tear-filled eyes. Somehow he didn't know what to say. How could he possibly tell her what he was feeling right now? He couldn't even tell himself. Gently, he released her, and she fell back against the wall. She slid down it slowly and sat with her face in her hands, sobbing. Johnny stepped off the porch and strode across the yard, stepping over the empty shotgun in the dirt. If the Cordays had another gun and wanted to shoot him in the back, well, let them, he thought. He caught up his horse, mounted, and rode off toward the horizon, where King Royal sat tall in the saddle on his mount, waiting for him. As he approached Royal, he suddenly kicked his horse in the ribs and sent him into a gallop, passing the old man and leaving him behind. King grimaced and nudged his horse forward at a canter for a while. Realizing that Johnny was not going to slow down, he finally whipped the reins against his horse's neck and sent him into a full gallop after him. King had barely caught up to him by the time they rode into the ranch house yard. Both horses were lathered and blowing hard as they came to a halt near the corral gate. Johnny quickly slid to the ground and began stripping the saddle and gear from the black's back. King Royal remained in the saddle, staring down at Johnny. "No need to mistreat horses just because you're mad at me." Johnny continued his work, not looking back. "Horses? Men? What difference does it make to you?" "I'll tell you, what difference? Horses are just dumb animals. They don't know right or wrong, just what they're taught. People are evil, born that way, live that way. They have to be dealt with justice." "Your justice, you mean?" Johnny whirled to look up at him. "Yes, my justice. I fought and built this country. It's up to me to see that no man destroys it." He stepped down from the saddle, handed the reins to Johnny. "I'm sure you understand, kid." There was a knowing look on his face as he said, "Kid. Take care of the horses, and when you simmer down, come on up to the house." He started to walk away, then stopped and turned. "Oh, kid, I like the way you handled yourself today. Thanks for covering me." Then he added, "That gun I gave you isn't the best. I suggest that if you've got one of your own, you ought to wear it." He grinned wryly, turned and strode away. What the hell did that mean? Did King Royal know who he really was? If so, what kind of game was he playing? Maybe it was time to collect his money from Seth Bascom and ride out. And do what? Go back to being the Laredo Kid? He led the unsaddled horses into the main corral and walked them a while to cool them off and do some thinking himself. As he walked them around, he could see into a small corral behind the barn. There was just one horse in there. The hammerhead roan called Demon paced restlessly back and forth, nudging the split rail fence from time to time and whinnying with frustration. Just like me, Johnny thought. A poor animal trapped, just floundering in the wind. Nowhere to go, and probably wouldn't know where to go if he could. Chapter 9. Supper time found the entire royal family, except for Luke, sitting quietly, picking at their meals with little conversation. King cut his steak methodically and seemed to be relishing his dinner, although his eyes would drift toward Johnny every now and then. The ladies of the household worked at their plates, saying little, other than to pass plates. Johnny picked broodingly at his food, hardly taking a bite, and never once looking up at King Royal. Luke finally came in, hung his hat on the hat rack, kissed his mother on the cheek, and sat down quietly, not at all like his usual boisterous self. "Where were you today?" King asked icily. Luke stared at him, trying to think of what to say. His face was ashen, and his usually jovial eyes were wary. Before he could answer, Johnny spoke up for one of the few times he had uttered a word since the meal began. "Oh, you don't have to worry about Luke," he said coolly. "He had my back covered all the time." He looked Luke straight in the eye. Luke swallowed hard. He knew what Johnny meant. "Someone took a shot at me today. Probably another rustler that got away. Good thing for me, Luke was there." He directed to King, then added, "I think I can always count on Luke covering my back. Can't I, brother?" "Yeah," Luke countered. "You can count on it." King could feel the tension, but played along. "Well, I'm glad to see you two are finally getting along. How come you didn't tell me about this before, Johnny?" "As you recall, I guess I wasn't much in the mood for talking." "No, you weren't," King said. "Perhaps you'll feel better in the morning. I want you to take charge of the branding tomorrow. It's time you started being the boss around here." Then to Luke, "I want you out there with your brother too. Help him to get the feel of things." He looked from Johnny to Luke. "Now, if you all will excuse me, I think I'll do some work in my study for a while, before I turn in." Everyone was silent as they watched the old man walk away. When the study door closed behind him, Luke said, "So I'm working for you now, brother." He emphasized the word with a sneer. "Good," Johnny answered, as if he didn't catch the meaning. "We'll ride out at dawn." "No, we won't," Luke said. "I'll meet you there. I'm spending the night in town." He stood up brusquely, whipped his hat off the hat rack, gave his mother a furtive kiss on the cheek, and stormed out without saying another word. Luke's mother watched him go. "It's been a trying day for everyone," she said. "Except for your husband," Johnny said flatly. "Now, if you'll excuse me." He tossed down his napkin, caught Lila's pained expression, knowing that she felt concern for both Johnny and her father, and stepped outside onto the porch. The night air had a chill and a crispness to it. A light breeze brushed his cheek and it felt good. The sky was black velvet by now, studded with stars and a sliver of a first quarter moon. There was something about the darkness and coolness of night that always seemed to calm him and refresh him. Perhaps it was the darkness most of all. A place where he could disappear completely. Hidden from the world, and maybe he could tell himself that he was hidden from who he was, or who he wasn't. He just didn't seem to know anymore. He gazed across the ranch yard, heard the horses milling in the corrals, and heard the stamping and pacing of the single horse in the small corral. The hammerhead roan constantly thrashed about, whickering mournfully, now and then, a lonely creature without freedom, without a life of purpose. Johnny leaned against the porch railing, holding the upright support, and stood there for a while, trying not to think about anything. Finally, he reached inside his shirt, took out a tobacco pouch and the makings. Absent-mindedly, but deftly, he poured the contents of the pouch into the papers and rolled a quirly as he watched Luke Thorne emerge from the barn, leading a saddled horse. He swung lithely into the saddle and rode off. He had said he was going to town, but Green River was off to the west. Luke rode northward and easterly, the direction of the Wishbone and Millie Corday. Johnny wondered how welcome Luke was going to be now that King had hung Danny Corday. He guessed Luke could be in deep trouble going up there. But it was his trouble, and he would have to handle it if he wasn't smart enough to stay away. Johnny smoked for a while. Then, as the glowing end of the cigarette grew short, a feminine voice sounded behind him. He turned and saw her framed in the open doorway, light behind her, her face in shadows. At first, he thought it was Florence, but as she closed the door behind her and came forward, she spoke again. "Don't judge King too harshly, Johnny." It was Heather. Her expression was more serious than he had seen her before. "He may be difficult for you to understand, but he is a great man. Harsh and brutal at times, but nevertheless a great man. Perhaps it's more difficult for you to understand because in many ways you're both alike. Strong, determined, full of righteousness with your own codes." "No one ever called me righteous before," Johnny countered, "and there is no way King and I could be alike." He tossed down the cigarette stub and ground it out with his heel. "Why not? You're his son, aren't you?" At this moment, Johnny would like to have said no. Then he could say to hell with all of this and just walk away. Sometimes, I guess I'd like to not believe it. "So would I," she said coyly. Johnny got the drift but said nothing. Recognizing Johnny's reluctance at that, she added, "King Royal is a real man, Johnny, and so are you. A lot alike in a lot of ways. You're going to have to accept that." Suddenly, feeling very uncomfortable, he tried to turn the conversation into a different direction. "I've never seen you this serious before. So tell me, what happened to the flighty, man-chasing Belle I've come to know?" "It's not all a facade," she said, "but sometimes it's best not to let people know you too well. It's good to have people underestimate you. I never underestimate anyone, especially King and you." "I'd never underestimate you, Heather." "No, I'm sure you wouldn't." She moved closer and grasped both his arms. His eyes flashed with frustration when the door behind them suddenly opened. Light spilled out onto the porch. Lila stood in the doorway. She said brusquely, "Heather, Mother says it's getting cold outside. You should come in right away." There was an angry expression on her face, and she scowled at Johnny. "I'll be right there," Heather answered. "You'd better close the door since it's so cold." Lila pursed her lips and slammed the door. "Seems to me it's a little cold in there already," Johnny mused. "I do believe my little sister seems a bit jealous. Lucky for me she's your sister." Then she added in a whisper, "Just remember, you're not my brother." She flashed her lashes, whirled, and disappeared inside the house. Now what the hell did that mean? Does she know he's not the real Johnny Royal? Even if he were, Heather and he would not be brother and sister in the absolute sense. They both had different parents. Today had been a difficult day. He had wondered if King knew who he really was. And now, Heather. Was he getting paranoid, or did his deception actually show through? Uneasiness gnawed at him, and he felt as restless as the imprisoned roan in the solitary corral. His mind filled with doubts and worries, he walked across the yard and behind the barn. He watched the horse pacing and pawing at the dirt. He felt a kinship with the animal. Both were friendless, alone, and trapped. An idea came to him, and he turned and walked back to the house. Instead of going in the front door, he went around to the back and stepped into the kitchen. Elvira was just putting away the supper dishes. She turned as the door opened. "Oh, it's you, Mr. Johnny," she said with a broad, warm smile. "Are you finally hungry? I noticed you didn't eat much at the table." "No, Elvira," he answered. "I was wondering if you have any lumps of sugar I could have." Why, sure, but don't tell me you have that big a sweet tooth. No, I want to make friends with a horse. Seemed to me you should be making friends with Mr. Royal, she answered. I'm afraid it would take a lot more than sugar, Elvira. You are right there, Mr. Johnny. Then she added, Mr. Royal can be a strange man at times, but he's a fair man. Everyone seemed to be standing up for the old ogre, Johnny thought. You've been with him a long time. Haven't you, Elvira? Yes, sir, since long before the war. Then you know the war set you free? Land, yes, Mr. Johnny. Do you think we are slaves here? No, sir, not even before the war. Mr. Royal has treated us well. He never treated us as slaves. We've always had fine quarters, and we have always been paid well. There was admiration in her eyes as she spoke. I guess you know him a lot better than I do, then, Johnny acquiesced. I've been here a long time, Mr. Johnny. I've seen good things, and I've seen bad, but Mr. Royal is a great man. With greatness comes responsibility, and it can wear on a man. I can't say that I approve of the way he handles things, but it's not my place to judge. I felt really bad about the way he treated the first Mrs. Royal and her baby. She was a fine woman, and I held and took care of that baby. It nearly broke my heart to see them go. I just didn't understand it all. Was he still being paranoid, Johnny thought? Or did everyone here know he was a fake? Elvira referred to the baby as if she wasn't referring to him. Or was this just the way she talked? He certainly didn't like the way the conversation was going. He hesitated before saying it, but he needed to know. He said, You took care of me as a baby? You are such a nice lady, I should have remembered. Elvira leveled her gaze, and her expression was very serious. You are a very nice man, Mr. Johnny, but you weren't the baby I held. Johnny didn't know what to say. Elvira continued. That baby had the sparkle of the devil in his eyes. Your eyes are sad, but there is a warmness to them. A person changes as he grows, Johnny countered. Yes, the sadness you acquired, but the warm eyes would have been there from the beginning. Mrs. Royal's baby didn't have that warmth. Have you told King what you think? He was almost afraid to ask. No, and I won't. Don't worry. Do you think he already knows? I don't know, Mr. Johnny. If he does, I don't think it matters. You make a good son. He knows that. Now I best get that sugar you wanted. There was a dim light in the window of Sam Corday's ranch house. All was quiet. The yard was empty. The buckboard seemed to be missing, and the two horses used as a team were not in the corral. Perhaps that meant that Sam, and hopefully, Larry were not there. They would have had to take Danny's body into town. Luke Thorne swallowed hard and reluctantly eased his horse into the yard. He knew he would not be welcome anymore, but he had to see Millie and tell her. He had to tell her he had nothing to do with Danny's lynching. He tied his horse at the hitch rail and stepped up to the door. He raised his fist to knock, hesitated, and tried to compose himself. His knees trembled and he felt weak. The same nausea he felt when seeing Danny on the end of the rope welled up on him. With light taps, he rasped his knuckles against the board door, almost wishing he could not be heard. After a moment, the door swung open. Millie stood in the lighted frame. Her face was drawn and her eyes were red. Luke, she shouted almost hysterically, go away. Why did you come here? Millie, he started. I'm so sorry. You've got to believe me. I had nothing to do with it. You've got to believe me. Oh, Luke, she sobbed. You've got to go away. Don't you understand? My father will kill you if he catches you here. Luke's eyes danced furtively, looking past her. Is he here now? Luke asked. No, Pa and Larry took Danny's body into town. They've been gone a long time. They could be back almost any time. You can't let Pa find you here. You've got to go. She flung herself into his arms and buried her face against his chest. I'll meet you at the pond tomorrow night. Just like we used to, she sobbed. Oh, Luke, why did things have to turn out like this? Why couldn't we have gotten married and been happy like other couples? She wasn't asking for an answer. Chapter 10. It was already hot by mid-morning. The sky was pale blue, and the vivid colors of green hillsides and lush valleys glistened in the spring air. Johnny had been on the job since dawn, working side by side with the hands, hazing cattle out of the breaks and draws, and helping with the branding. He had ridden out before dawn with Harka. King had also risen early, but was not about to ride out to the range today. He and Johnny talked congenially over breakfast, neither one of them mentioning the events of the day before. He was holding down a steer, while another hand applied the branding iron, when Johnny saw Luke Thorne ride in. He had wondered when Luke would show up and in what condition he might be in. He had been uneasy all morning, never sure if Luke lay lying in wait out there, looking for the right opportunity to ambush him. He was fairly sure that it was Luke who tried it the day before, and it would be only a matter of time before he would try it again. He knew Luke saw him as he rode on by to catch up to another rider who was leading a fighting steer, a lasso strung tight around its horns. When the brand had burned enough hide and hair off the steer Johnny had been holding down, Johnny nodded to the wrangler with the iron, released his grip on the steer, and let it jump to its feet and run off, kicking its hind legs in the air, cooling off the sting. "I'll be right back," Johnny said, and signaled to another waddy to take his place. He hurried across the meadow toward Luke. He was actually far enough away for Johnny to ride a horse after him, but Johnny was in too big a hurry to catch one up. He strode swiftly, heavy leather chaps slapping back and forth as he moved. Luke saw him coming, and for a second, he thought about riding off. Then, thought he'd better not. Johnny was still wearing the 6-gun King had given him, and there was a grim, determined look on the new boss's face. "Where have you been? The morning's half shot," Johnny said sternly as he approached. "I guess I overslept, brother boss," Luke sneered, looking down from his saddle. "Besides, I figured you were man enough for both of us. I don't expect Sam Corday would have let you sleep over at his place. I saw you riding toward the Wishbone last night. If you did, you're looking for a whole lot more trouble than you'll ever get from me. You just let me worry about that, brother boss." He kicked his horse in the ribs and rode off. He went to work cutting out cattle at the far end of the meadow. Johnny had just gotten back to work, helping with the branding, when another rider rode in. The sun glinted brightly on the 5-pointed star on Sheriff Ben Stryker's black leather vest. Johnny led up the steer he was holding and walked over to meet him. He smiled thinly, ever wary of a man with a badge on his chest. "Good morning, Sheriff," Johnny greeted. "What brings you out here?" As if he didn't know. King had just strung up 2 men. Of course, the sheriff would have to be here. Stryker dismounted and held the reins to his horse. He didn't offer his hand. His face was stern and placid. "I'm afraid I have to take you in, kid," Stryker said. "Kid?" It echoed in Johnny's brain. This wasn't about the lynching? Johnny's pulse began to race. His hand brushed the top of his gun butt. "King's gone and done it again," Stryker said with disgust. "And once again, I have to pick up the pieces for him." "You were here about the lynching then?" Johnny asked reluctantly, hoping that was what this was all about. "Hanging," Stryker corrected. "It's still legal in Wyoming to hang horse thieves and cattle rustlers if they're caught in the act. Generally, we try to be a little more civilized than that and let the law take its course." Johnny tried not to let it show that he breathed a little easier. "I suppose King has done this before?" he queried. "It's been several years, but yes, he has. Times are changing, and people aren't going to stand for this sort of thing much longer. But you know, King wields a lot of weight in these parts." Johnny wanted to say, "You're his friend and his puppet, so he can get away with anything," but he didn't say it. "I need you to come to town with me and sign an affidavit as to what happened. Corday has been ranting and raving to high heaven, so I've got to go through the paperwork and make everything legal. King's already agreed to meet us in town. It was afternoon by the time Johnny and the sheriff reached Green River. King was already waiting at the county courthouse in Judge Lawton's chambers when they arrived. He had already prepared the necessary statement waiting for Ben Stryker to witness to his signature. Johnny was in the process of making his statement when Lila came in. She had come to town with King to do some shopping. Today, she was dressed more appropriately for a young lady with gingham dress and bonnet. She seemed to flush a little in front of Johnny, fully aware that he had noticed. She greeted him cordially, then let him get on with his statement. With all the legal work over, they all left Judge Lawton's chambers and stepped out on the street. King and Lila climbed into their carriage to drive off just as Abby Stryker came down the sidewalk. She thought she noticed a certain expression on Lila's face, but she tried to dismiss it, rationalizing that Lila was Johnny's sister. "Hello, Dad," she said. "Haven't seen you all day." "Been busy. Job to do, you know." "And you, Johnny," she smiled warmly. "Didn't expect to see you so soon since the other night. As I remember right, you were having a good time with Millie Corday?" There was a bit of accusation in her voice. "I don't suppose she's quite as friendly now." "Abby," her father scolded, "Johnny doesn't want to hear talk like that." "I suppose not. I really didn't mean anything by it, Johnny. It's just, well, there are other girls around," she flirted. "Abby," her father scolded again. "I'll be sure to look for them," Johnny said coolly. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have some other business to attend to in town before I return to the ranch." He tipped his hat and started off along the sidewalk. "Johnny," she called after him. He halted and turned. "I'm on my way to the post office to pick up Dad's mail. Since we're both going in the same direction, do you mind if I walk with you?" "Why no, Miss Stryker," he said, sweeping his hat off and bowing mockingly. "I'd be honored. My arm, madam." He crooked his elbow and offered his arm, which she grasped firmly and giggled. The conversation was light and cheerful. Abby did most of the talking, and Johnny enjoyed it. Although it amused him, he did find her company pleasing and knew he could like this girl very much. But her father was a sheriff, and he had just about decided to collect his $5,000 from Seth Bascom and ride out. He left her off at the door to the post office and continued on down the street to the hotel. The hotel clerk told him that Seth Bascom was staying there, but during the day, he could most likely be found at the Longhorn playing cards. The Longhorn was no cattle town saloon dive. It was very elegant, with rich carpets and tapestries. It had a large stage, and the east served as a music hall. The long mahogany bar was neat and highly polished. Customers didn't routinely stand next to it. Drinks were usually served at the gambling tables, and the clientele was generally more genteel. Seth Bascom was seated at a far table. Two well-dressed players sat on either side of him, chips stacked neatly. Johnny walked over and stood silently beside Bascom while he pondered his hand. "What brings you to town, Johnny?" Bascom asked without looking up. "Need to talk," Johnny said coldly. "Hang on a second," then to his opponents. "Call." He pushed his chips forward. The hand played out, and Bascom raked the pot in. "Gentlemen, if you'll excuse me, I have other matters to attend to." He signaled to the barkeep to take charge of his winnings. Then he accompanied Johnny to another table away from anyone else. "Well, kid," he said, "what's on your mind?" $5,000. I've decided to pull out." "Well, I must say, kid, there was that damn kid business again. It always made Johnny chill. I really am disappointed in you. I thought you were tougher. You going to let a little thing like a hanging stand in the way of a fortune?" "Not exactly a little thing," Johnny retorted. "The law's got no problem with it, so forget it. Unless you're squeamish, kid." "Just give me the damn 5,000, Johnny growled angrily. "All right, but I think you're making a big mistake." He reached inside his jacket and pulled out his wallet. 5,000 is mere chicken feed compared to what you can have." It doesn't seem to be chicken feed to you. Seems to me you just want the whole 10,000. Listen, kid, 10,000 is chicken feed. We have a golden opportunity here. We? Johnny's brows grew together. What do you expect to get out me staying besides the 10,000? I'll get to that later, Bascom smiled. Don't you understand? You'll be rich when you take over the royal crown. Oh yeah. What makes you think I'm going to take it over? Your daddy. He said so the other night. You're in charge now. No, King doesn't give up power that easily. He's still in control and always will be. No one lives forever, kid, Bascom chuckled. Meaning? You know what I mean, Bascom answered, ice in his words. Johnny's face turned dark and grim. Yeah, but you still haven't told me what your stake in this is. I expect you to pay me $100,000 a year after you take over the royal crown. No, I won't be greedy. I'll settle for 50,000. I pay you? Johnny almost laughed. That's the idea, kid. And just why should I pay you? Because I know you aren't the real Johnny Royal. Oh, and just who do you think I am? Johnny straightened in his chair, his eyes cold. Well, Bascom grinned. I guess you know that better than I do. Chapter 11. A week had passed by since Johnny's conversation with Seth Bascom. He never did like the man, and he was never sure that Bascom knew the truth about him. Bascom was playing a serious and dangerous game. Johnny had agreed to stick around for another week before deciding to ride. Somehow, he knew Bascom would never allow him that option. Johnny resigned himself to being Johnny Royal, the cattle king's son, and heir apparent to the richest cattle ranch in Wyoming. Hell, it wasn't that bad. As long as he didn't have to go back to being the Laredo Kid, he guessed he could handle it as long as Seth Bascom did nothing to speed up the process. He was sure that Bascom was a dangerous man, and if any harm were to befall King Royal, all bets would be off, and he would seek retribution from Bascom. He had made that point perfectly clear that day in the Longhorn. Bascom vowed that he meant no threat to King, but Johnny couldn't be sure. He had set himself to the work of being Johnny Royal. He worked the men hard, and he worked with them. He demanded a good day's work from the hands and got it. He was tough but fair, and the men were beginning to respect him. Johnny worked hard at shoring up relations with King Royal. He listened to the old man and took advice when he valued it, and gave his own opinions when he disagreed with the old man. King liked this approach, and gradually Johnny was beginning to like the elder Royal also. He tried to push the hanging incident from his mind, though it kept coming back to haunt him, and still keeping a barrier between the two men. Luke had kept his distance and did his work each day without complaint. Johnny wondered about this, but decided that Luke must be aware that Johnny had seen him ride out toward the wishbone every night. Johnny had been going out to the corral in the evenings. Ever since that first night, he had brought lumps of sugar to the roan. That was when he usually spotted Luke riding off. The roan had been warming up to Johnny these many nights, and had come to expect the nightly visits and the sugar. Johnny could now pet the animal and keep him calm. One day, Johnny tried a hackamore, and the horse did not fight it. He even stood still long enough for Johnny to comb and curry him. With a little cleaning up and grooming the roan was indeed a fine-looking horse. All in all, it had not been a bad week for the new Johnny Royal. But all that was to change this day. It was the first day that King had ridden out to the herd since the rustling incident and the death of Danny Corday. The other rustlers and the missing cattle still had not been found. The day had started as a routine day until Pete Healy came riding into the meadow, hell-bent for leather and yelling with excitement. Denver Blaine and several riders had culled out the branded cattle and herded them up toward the East Range earlier that morning, and Healy was with them. His horse slid to a halt as he brought him up abruptly close to King and Johnny. "We got big trouble, Mr. Royal," the Waddy blurted. "Darrow and his men are up on the wishbone and are stringing a barbed wire fence. Denver's holding the herd back, and he sent me back to get help and instructions." "What business does Darrow have fencing off the wishbone?" King bellowed. "Well, Sam Corday's with him, and they've already strung several miles. We'll have to take the herd around. Blaine figured you might want to fight it out instead." "He blamed well figured right," King said. "Corday is still sore, and he's probably joined forces with Darrow. Well, he's not going to get away with it." Johnny could see Royal practically licking his chops at the prospect of a fight. "Harka!" King shouted. "Get a dozen men mounted up. Make sure they've got guns." The Indian nodded and rode off around the camp. "Luke!" King called, and Luke nudged his mount close. "What now?" he asked, sounding peeved. "Take over the branding here with the men we leave behind. Be ready for trouble if we don't get back." "What's going on?" Luke's tone changed to worry and wonder. "Never mind, just do as I say." Within minutes, King, Johnny, Harka, and almost a dozen riders thundered out of camp, pushing their mounts to full speed, and disappeared over the horizon. Denver Blaine was holding the herd about 150 yards back away from the work on the fence when the Royal Crown riders arrived. King rode directly up to Blaine and told him to hold the cattle until he signaled him. Then he joined Johnny and the others, and they rode somewhat more leisurely and casually toward the fence. "What's going on here, Darrow?" King bellowed as they drew rein. "What's it look like?" Darrow said sardonically, "We're building a fence." Sam Corday stepped up beside Darrow, smiling. "Guess that's telling him, Harv," he jeered. "Sam, you can't fence this off. I paid you for right-of-way, and this year's commitment won't be over until the end of the year. If I have to, I can have the sheriff out here and have you arrested." "Why don't you just lynch me like you did those two boys last week?" "Why waste time with the sheriff? He only does what you tell him anyways." "I know you are angry, Sam, but building this fence won't help any. You're just making things worse for yourself." "Then, and you, Darrow, I suppose you're financing this fence. You're playing on Sam's grief for your own purposes." "Sam," King continued, "can't you see he's using you, fueling your hate?" "Don't listen to him, Sam," Darrow said. "Remember, he strung up one of my boys, too." "You asked for this, King," Corday growled. "We're not taking your guff anymore. Now take your cattle and go back the way you came." "I need to get to my East Range, and neither you nor Harvey Darrow is going to stop me. Take your men and equipment and move out. My men will take care of taking the fence down. You won't have to bother yourselves." King kept his voice even and flat. "We're not leaving, and you're not taking down anything," Darrow said, stepping forward with his hand close to his gun butt. King heaved a sigh. "Well, if that's the way you want it, this is how it's all going down. When I signal my men, they're going to stampede the herd right through you. If you want to stick around and get trampled, that's your business." "Trent, Stroud," Darrow said, lifting his hand in signal. Two hard-case-looking men stepped forward. They were both swarthy and dark, wearing crossed pistol belts and two guns slung low on each hip, but one man was heavier than the other. "If King or any of his men make a move to signal anyone, kill them." They grinned and spread their hands close to their pistols. They were obviously hired guns, and they looked like they enjoyed their work. Johnny eyed them closely, watching their eyes, knowing King would force their hands and they would shoot. And they would shoot to kill. King glanced from man to man, then at Darrow and Corday, then back to Darrow. He smiled thinly and said, "Have it your way, but you'd better be fast." He neck-reined his horse a quarter turn and started to raise his arm in signal. The gunmen's hands flashed to their guns. One had his halfway out of the holster, and the other had his 3/4 out, when flame belched from Johnny's 6-gun, and the two shots echoed across the open range. Johnny's hand had flashed down and upward so fast, no one hardly saw him draw. King sidled his mount away from Johnny, making room for Johnny's stamping horse that was shying at the noise and smell of death. Both gunnies folded and crumpled to the ground. The grass turned red as blood poured from the gaping gut-shot holes in each of the gunmen's midsection. Realizing what had happened, 2 more men went for their pistols. Johnny swung the muzzle of his shooter right and left, firing twice, sounding almost as one blast. The 2 men fell dead. Darrow himself was reaching for his own weapon, but Johnny brought his smoking barrel around, leveling straight at his face. "Leave it alone," Johnny warned coldly. "Unless you want to join the others in hell right now. Your choice." His jaw tightened. Darrow could hardly believe what had just happened. His hand moved away from his pistol quickly. His chin trembled, and he felt weak in the knees. He looked from Johnny to King. "So, you brought in a hired gun and passed him off as your son. You always was a low-down snake, King." "Maybe you'll think twice before you try to stand up to me, Darrow," King said, smiling, not bothering to clarify the gunfighter or son issue. "Now how about picking up your trash and getting the hell out of here? Now." Harvey Darrow felt defeated and suddenly drained of all strength and energy. "As I said, Harvey, we'll take care of pulling down the fence. There's nothing for you to hang around here for." "All right, King," Darrow said through clenched teeth. "You win, this time." "But Harv," Sam Corday fumed, "you can't let him get away with this." "Shut up, you old fool," Harvey Darrow shouted. "They've got us this time." He nodded toward Johnny. "But we can play the same game," he directed to King. "You brought in a gunfighter. We can too." "Seems to me you've already done that," King retorted. Darrow glanced at the men lying dead on the ground and scoffed. "Hell, they weren't gunfighters, just mean bullies. We'll see how that gunfighting so-called son of yours can stack up to real competition." "Bring them on," Johnny warned coldly. His fist tightened around the gun butt, and his knuckles whitened. Darrow stared directly into those steely eyes. He saw danger and knew he was pushing his luck. He swallowed hard, a lump in his throat. He tried to conceal it and keep his toughness to the fore. "I'll be back," Darrow warned sharply, then turned on his heel before he could show his fear to the Royals. Then to his men, "All right, listen up, men. Gather up the teams, wagons, and equipment and head on back to the ranch. And pick up those carcasses and get them out of here." Darrow walked off to his horse, Corday close on his heels. "But Harv," Sam started to plead. "Go home, Sam," Darrow ordered with annoyance, not even bothering to turn toward the grizzled old man. "We'll talk about it later." He climbed into the saddle, wheeled his mount, and rode off toward the retreating wagons. King Royal, a wide grin of triumph on his face, motioned toward his other riders. "You men, start taking that barbed wire down. Then to Harka, go back to the herd. Send some more men to come help with the fence. And tell Blaine to bring the herd on through as soon as enough of the fence is cleared." Johnny sat quietly in his saddle, 6 guns still in hand, until Darrow and his men disappeared over the horizon. As if an automatic response, he twirled the cylinder of his Colt, letting the spent cartridges eject and fall to the ground. He deftly fed new rounds in and closed the cylinder gate. Then sheathed the weapon firmly into the leather holster. King eyed the professional way this young man handled the gun. His eyes glinted with approval, yet he said nothing. They sat their mounts idly for several minutes, watching the activity of the men tearing down the fence. Then, as the herd started moving, the 2 men angled their horses to the side out of the way of the oncoming cattle. They sat there a while, watching the herd pass by. King knew Johnny was angry again. He said nothing, just waited for the young man to say what was on his mind. Finally, Johnny reined his mount to face the elder royal. "A week ago, 2 men died, and today another 4. I don't suppose this is the end of it," he said solemnly. "No, I don't suppose it is," King agreed. no fear, regret, nor remorse in his tone. "So," Johnny said, "is Darrow right? Is this what you brought me here for, to be your hired gun?" "No," King answered flatly. "I brought you here to be my son." A cold chill went up Johnny's spine. He hesitated to say it, but then, throwing all caution to the wind, he blurted it out. "Just what makes you so certain I am your son?" He suddenly wanted to tell the whole world and shuck this stupid charade. "Who else could you be?" King Royal smiled slyly. "I know you're not the Laredo Kid." He kicked his mount in the flanks and rode off after the herd. Chapter 12. A half-moon rode lightly in the dark sky and was almost obscured by the encroaching heavy dark rain clouds floating in from the east as Johnny gazed out his room window. It was almost midnight, and the rest of the ranch was dark and quiet. He had watched Luke ride off toward the Wishbone earlier on as he had done every other night. He must be meeting Millie Corday somewhere on the sly without letting her old man know he was around. With trouble brewing at breakneck speed, Luke was courting more danger every night. But that was his problem. Johnny had plenty of his own. As he pondered the day's events, he was more sure than ever he was playing a dangerous game also. He had so badly wanted to discard the Laredo Kid and make a new life for himself. Not just a new life, but a good life. And being the Cattle King's son could have provided it, but now he was certain that being the Laredo Kid or being Johnny Royal would be the same thing. He would be the same man, just different names with a gun in his hand, meting out death and destruction, always feeling sick and alone. Besides, did King know he was the Laredo Kid? King had made no further mention of it for the rest of the day. If he didn't know who he was, why of all of the gunfighters out there would he have singled out the name of the Laredo Kid? What was the old fox's game anyhow? If he did in fact know who he was, how did he know it? Bascombe? No, that couldn't be. Bascombe was playing his own game. His mind still racing, he couldn't sleep. Maybe it was time he pulled up stakes. Just ride out without anyone knowing. By the time his absence was detected, he would be long gone. Maybe he could hide under a different name altogether, in a different place. But he had tried that before, and somehow it had never worked. He tried to distract himself, and suddenly thought of the hammerhead roan. He had been preoccupied, and had not yet visited his friend tonight. He put on a light jacket, went to the kitchen, and wrapped the usual amount of sugar for the roan. The roan sensed him coming and whickered softly. He trotted close to the corral rail, his tail swishing in anticipation. "Bet you thought I forgot about you, old boy," Johnny said, holding out a lump of sugar between the rails. The roan licked at it eagerly, then took it in his mouth. Johnny ran his fingers up and down the long, slender face and rubbed him behind the ears while feeding him more sugar. As the horse munched and nuzzled his hand, Johnny came to a decision. "You know, old boy," he said lowly, "you don't belong here, penned up and alone." Then he sighed grimly to himself. "And neither do I." He turned and walked back to the house. The roan neighed after him. Leaving everything else behind, Johnny had stuffed the $7,000 from the bank robbery and the pistol and belt he usually wore as the Laredo Kid into his saddlebags. He had then gone to the barn, saddled up a horse, and gathered up a hackamore. He led his mount out to the corral and ground hitched him. Once again, the roan was a little wary of the hackamore, but his growing trust in his friend let him fasten it in place. Johnny then led him out of the corral, mounted up, and rode off, leading the roan carefully behind him. In a few minutes, they topped a rise. Johnny halted his horses and turned in the saddle to look back. The ranch house and outbuildings were receding into the distance already, just dark shapes in the night. Johnny felt a pang of regret, choked it back, then spurred his mount forward and rode on. Soon, it had all been left behind. Although he was still on Royal Crown land, He could no longer see any trace of the ranch buildings. He tried to tell himself that he had broken free at last, but something still gnawed at the pit of his stomach. He gazed at the roan trudging along behind. "This is far as I'm taking you, old boy," he said as he dismounted and started to lift the hackamore from the roan's neck. "I'd like to keep you, boy, but you should be free. You shouldn't belong to anyone, and no one is ever going to call you demon again. It's not a fit name. You're better off being nameless and free." Somehow he wished the same applied to himself. He patted the roan softly on his sleek neck, turned the horse's head away from him, and said, "Off with you now, boy." He urged him forward. The roan hesitated and whickered softly, looking back at his friend with big, soulful black eyes. "Go on now," Johnny urged with a lump in his throat. Then he slapped the horse on the rump with his hat and yelled, "Hee-yah!" The roan surged forward and ran off into the darkness. Johnny stood there a while, just staring into the darkness and listening to the receding hoofbeats and the silence of the night. He started suddenly as a voice rang out behind him. "What are you doing out here letting King's horse get away?" Johnny swung around abruptly. He saw lightning flash in the distance and heard a slight rumble of thunder following. Luke Thorne, atop his bay horse, was outlined against the momentary flash. "I might just ask what you're doing out here myself," Johnny sneered, "but I already know. I've seen you sneaking out to the Wishbone every night. Back early, aren't you?" "Storm's coming. I figured I'd get back ahead of it." "Corday ever catches you on his land, you may never get back," Johnny stated. "Never you mind, brother boss," Luke replied. "I can take care of myself. I don't need you telling me what to do. I can handle Corday." Sure you can," Johnny said sarcastically. Luke grimaced with anger. "And I can handle you too, sonny boy." "Well, you are bigger than me, Luke, and I suppose that's just your style anyways. But anytime you want to take a shot, go ahead." "Oh, I forgot. You already took a shot at me. When my back was turned that day of the hanging. I owe you one." Luke dismounted slowly, dropped the reins, and stepped forward. "All right, I'm ready to collect." He raised his arms and went into a boxer's stance, his huge fists balled into mallets. Johnny stepped away from his horse and raised his fists, waiting for the attack. Luke circled close. Johnny circled back the other way. The two men kept moving, sliding ever closer to each other, each one watching the other's moves, the glints in their eyes. Johnny saw it in Luke's eyes, just before the bigger man let loose and threw the first punch. Johnny ducked back, jerking his head aside as Luke's fist caught him in the jaw and glanced off, muted by the sudden move, but nevertheless a crushing blow. Johnny fell backward, falling slightly to his right, but another blow from Luke's left fist buried into his midsection and prevented him from falling to the ground. He doubled up with pain, breath driven from his lungs. He dropped his arms to reach for his pained ribs, just long enough for Luke to come in with an uppercut, landing under the chin, straightening Johnny's body upward and sending him sprawling beneath his horse's hoofs. The horse shied nervously, his shod hoofs dancing about. Out of the corner of his eyes, Johnny could see the flailing feet. With a sudden burst, he managed to gather up enough strength to roll out from under. The horse slid against Luke's bay and spooked it. They both skittered a short distance away. Johnny was still rolling when Luke dived for him on the ground, and he managed to slide out from under Luke's crashing body just in time. Luke plummeted into the dirt, sliding onto his chest. Johnny whipped his body around into a half-sitting position on his knees, clasped both hands together, and drove them between Luke's shoulder blades and pushing his face further into the dirt. Luke grunted, spitting dirt between his teeth. Johnny reached out to the side of the trail. His fingers curled around a fist-sized rock, and with one flowing motion, he arced it upward and down on Luke's skull. Luke's body relaxed as he slumped flat out in the trail. Blood oozed from his scalp. Johnny had raised the rock again, ready to strike, when he caught himself. As much as he'd like to hit him again, he could see that Luke was already unconscious. Shakily, Johnny climbed to his feet. He swayed unsteadily, breathing hard and holding his midsection. Luke started to move, writhing and groaning, then passing out again. Well, at least Johnny hadn't killed the Sidewinder. As he retrieved his hat, he heard the clip-clop of a horse's hoofs from up the trail. He straightened and turned to see the roan trotting up to him. Johnny patted him while the roan nickered and nuzzled him affectionately. "You had your chance for freedom, fella. You came back. I don't know what the hell for. It certainly isn't good for you." Then, as he realized what he was saying, he almost smiled to himself. "I guess you're setting the example, so let's go home." He turned and gathered up his saddle bronc and started back toward the ranch, the roan following close behind him, leaving Luke to recover on his own. The night had turned somewhat cooler by the time they returned to the corral. "Looks like a rough night ahead, fella," Johnny mused, glancing up at the gathering storm clouds. Lightning flashed in the northeast, and a low rumble signaled the encroachment of another spring storm. "Let's try you out in a stall tonight. It'll keep you dry." He turned and walked into the barn. The roan neighed and trotted after him. Johnny lit a lantern and replaced it on its hook in the barn. Then he led the horse into a stall. He had been skittish the first time he had experienced a hackamore, but the stall was a different matter. Not only was it new to him, it was confining. He shied suspiciously, but soon settled down as Johnny patted his neck and reassured him it was all right. Johnny fed him a handful of oats. The roan whickered contentedly. Johnny was just leaving the stall when a voice said, "So you can even soothe the savage beast." Johnny started, coming up short to an abrupt halt. Lightning flashed in the sky outside, and in the instant, he could see a shadowy female form standing in the barn doorway. The shadow moved forward as the lightning disappeared, and as it moved into the light of the lantern, he could see it was Heather Thorne. She was dressed in a light blue robe, tied tightly about the waist, and the folds of her long yellow nightgown brushed her matching slippers. "He's hardly a savage beast," Johnny retorted flatly. Somehow he felt he was due for more trouble this day. The kind you couldn't handle with a gun. He suddenly felt unarmed. She was close to him now, staring up into his face. For the first time, she saw the bruise on his cheek and winced in sympathy. "What happened to you?" she asked. He could smell her perfume, even above the barn smells. They made an odd contrasting scent. "Must have fallen off a horse," he said flippantly. "I doubt that. More like Brother Luke got a piece of you," she giggled, knowing she was probably right. "I heard about what you did today," she said almost in a whisper. "I'm not very proud of it," Johnny said coldly. 4 men are dead tonight that were alive and kicking just 1 night ago." "That was their choice, wasn't it?" "Yes," he said resolutely, "but nonetheless, they are dead. And King Royal is still alive, thanks to you." "That's right," he said, "but you didn't come out here this time of night to remind me of it." "Well, no," she flashed her lashes. "But I've seen you coming out here every night. You seem lonely. Surely you would like to do better than a horse." Johnny cocked his head and shrugged. "I guess we've got a lot in common." "I'm glad you see it that way, Johnny." She moved closer. "I mean the horse," Johnny explained. "The horse and I have a lot in common." She didn't bat an eye with offense. She giggled. "Well, if it's horsing around you like—" "Heather," he said, taking her arm and turning her toward the door. "I think it's time you got back to bed." He guided her through the door into the yard. She laughed. "I was beginning to think you'd never ask." "Now enough of this nonsense," Johnny cajoled. Lightning flashed again, followed by a roll of thunder. A few drops of rain started to fall. "You'd better get inside. And remember, I'm your brother." She giggled, then reached up and gave him a kiss. Lightning flashed again. From an upstairs window, Lila gazed out on the scene below, a scowl on her face. "Oh, but Johnny," Heather said. "You are not my brother." She laughed and dashed inside, just as the rain began to pour in a torrent. He stood there a moment trying to figure what that was all about. Did everybody know he was not Johnny Royal? Upstairs, Lila moved away from the window. She gritted her teeth and clenched her fists. She was mad. Good and mad, and she was going to get even. Pete Healy and Gordon Strutz had been on Nighthawk for the past 2 hours. 4 men were still in camp, and 2 of them were standing guard. After the incident with the Aero D crowd, security had been heightened. It had been a stressful day, and the night had only added to that stress. The constant flash of lightning and crashing of thunder had set the cattle on edge all night. It wouldn't take much to spook them into stampede. The Nighthawks became more and more edgy as the cattle seemed to become more restless. "I don't like it at all," Pete said to Strutz as they passed each other on their turns around the herd. Lightning flashed again, and several heads stamped and churned sod. "Look at their horns glowing. I tell you, we're going to have hell on our hands." "They're not glowing. That's just reflection from the lightning. Don't tell me you believe those old wives' tales about glowing horns," Gordon chuckled. Lightning flashed again. Thunder rolled, and mixed in the crash was the report of a rifle. Strutz's eyes bulged. He stiffened and stretched tall in the saddle, blood running down the back of his shirt. Healy caught a brief glimpse of his partner spilling from the saddle, which was the last thing he would ever see. Another shot roared in the echo of the receding thunder, and Pete pitched backward out of the saddle. The herd began to churn in a frenzy. Then, as rapid gunfire erupted and shadowed riders thundered out of the dark, shouting and charging into the herd, the cattle bolted into a run. With horns clashing and bodies smashing into each other, the herd stampeded east. The men in camp barely had time to react as the charging beast overran the camp. The chuck wagon overturned and was torn to shreds by the flurry of hooves. Waddies went down amidst the turmoil, trampled beyond all recognition. In a matter of moments, the herd had scattered far and wide, leaving dead cattle and trampled wranglers half buried in mud, with torrential rain pouring over them. The attackers, having accomplished their mission, turned their mounts and rode back into the darkness of the night from whence they came. Chapter 13. King Royal was angry, very angry. His eyes burned with fury, and his broad face was stern and cold. The mud-caked, mutilated bodies of his men and the cattle that had died in the stampede lay drying in the mid-morning sun. Off in the distance, he could see scattered specks of dark shapes moving in the sunlight. These were only a lingering part of the herd. The rest had been scattered out of sight. It would take a lot of men and a lot of work to round them up again. Harka had already detailed several men to attend to the bodies of the fallen ranch hands. King paced back and forth in the wet grass, occasionally stopping and gazing off into the distance. He was not a man to blame himself for anything, but the men who had died here for $1 a day job certainly did not deserve to have their lives cut short this way. He didn't bother to turn as Johnny stepped up to his side, but he knew the young man was there. "Darrow's going to pay for this, Johnny," he said. "Too many men have died." "That's right," Johnny said flatly. "Too many. On both sides. How many more have to die?" King finally turned to face him. He tried to hide the sudden surprise on his face as he noticed Johnny had slid the pistol and belt that King had given him last week around to his left so the pistol would be butt forward. On his right hip, riding low, was a gleaming black holster hanging from a wide matching cartridge belt. It was well oiled and had been cut partially away, leaving room for the staghorn pistol butt and the trigger guard of a well-worn 6-gun to protrude out and away from his thigh, where his hand could quickly snatch the weapon. King noted how the trigger had been tied back. The fancy pistol wasn't there when they rode out to the range this morning, so it must have been in his saddlebag all along. Apparently, the sight of the dead riders and the destruction here today had prompted him to put it on. King said nothing to indicate he noticed anything different about him, just as he had refrained from asking about the bruise on Johnny's face, but somehow he felt the young man had come to a decision of sorts. "That's up to Darrow," King said impassively. "And you," Johnny stated, then added, "what about Corday?" "Oh, Sam's an old fool. Darrow is the one to worry about. He's the one behind this mess." He nodded toward the scene of destruction in front of him. "We need proof," Johnny said. "If we just go after him, a lot of people are going to die. We need to do this legal and proper." As much as he hated to say it, or think it, Johnny said, "We need to bring the sheriff into this. Get a warrant issued and bring Darrow in for trial. But as I said, first we need proof he was behind this, so I think we ought to get on the trail of those Jehus that jumped the herd right away before the trail dries up completely." "All right, son," King agreed. "We're going to need all the men we've got to round up the herd, so it will have to be just you and me and Harka on the trail." At first, the trail was fairly easy to follow. The tracks of 5 horses showed plainly in the red clay mud, and they were headed due west. As noon approached, the trail became harder to see as the warming sun dried the tracks. It was still an easy read for Harka, though, and it soon became evident that the attackers were headed toward the town of Green River. With the trail this clear, they could push their mounts along at a fairly fast pace. With any luck, they would find their quarry still in town when they got there. They were about 2 miles from Green River when it happened. As they rode through a narrow, twisting pass, a rifle cracked from the bluff on the left side of the trail. But, just an instant before, the ever-vigilant Harka had detected a glint of sunlight on the rifle barrel. He shouted warning and crashed his horse into the side of King's mount, pushing him over to bump into Johnny's horse. Harka's paint horse reared on 2 legs, horse and rider now between the rifle and the royals. The bullet whizzed past Harka, slicing the air just under his chin, angling high and missing both Johnny and King Royal as their horses thrashed about. Harka had his rifle out by the time his horse came down on all 4 feet. He fired 3 times in rapid succession at the top of the bluff. He couldn't see the assailant, but he hoped his firepower would keep the attacker from firing again, at least keep him from firing accurately. Johnny whipped his horse around, crowding in front of King's horse. He now had his rifle out and spurred his mount closer to Harka. The rifle on the bluff bellowed again, twice, so close together that it sounded almost as one. King yelped with pain. His horse shied, and the old man slumped from the saddle onto the trail. Johnny saw the hit out of the corner of his eye, but the rifleman was the first order of business. He fired back after the assailant, levering round after round into his Winchester. With both he and Harka firing a fusillade of lead at the top of the bluff, there was no more return fire from the rifleman. Finally, realizing it was over, they ceased firing. Harka remained vigilant, watching the bluff for any movement or sign the ambusher was still there. Johnny Neck reined his horse to where King lay on his side. He sheathed his rifle, dismounted, ran to his side and turned the elder Royal, lifting his shoulders up. "Don't look so glum, kid," King Royal joked. "I may still be alive, but maybe they'll do a better job next time." Johnny grimaced. "You old faker. He didn't even touch you." "Wrong there, kid." King rolled to the side, revealing a gaping wound in his left thigh. Blood was gushing out heavily. Nasty wound, Johnny thought. Have to stop the bleeding. He ripped the old man's pant leg away from the bullet hole. "I paid a good $1 for those breeches," King complained. "Then pay another good $1 for another pair. You've got it." Johnny whipped off his bandana and stuffed it into the wound. He then went to his horse and retrieved pigging strings from the saddlebags. He returned to King and used them as a tourniquet. He lifted King to a sitting position. "This will have to do until we get to Green River. Think you can ride?" "Of course I can ride," the old man blustered, trying to pull himself to his feet. Johnny half lifted him. King tried to shake him off at first, but the pain shot through him like a torch and he winced. "Don't need your help," King growled, more angry at himself. Harka had angled his horse close and looked down at the struggling pair. He still held his rifle in one hand by the trigger guard and stock. Johnny said to him, "We've got to get him into town and see a doc." Harka nodded, waved his rifle in half salute, whipped his paint horse around, and rode off toward the bluff. Johnny and King watched him go. "I wouldn't want to be in that Jehu's boots when Harka catches up to him." King smiled through his pain. By the time they reached Green River, King was hunched over the saddle, hardly able to hang on. His face had drained of all color, and his eyes were blank. His leg was now a bloody mess, and blood dripped along the trail behind his horse. Johnny had to halt them twice on the way, to help him shift in the saddle and prop him up. At the second stop, he used his remaining pigging strings to tie the old man's hands to the saddle horn, and used rope to tie his feet together under his horse's belly. They rode directly to Doc Tatum's office, which was in his white frame house at the edge of town. King grumbled and complained the whole time Johnny helped him inside, and while Doc Tatum got him settled and started to work on him. Knowing he had put the elder royal in good hands, and there was nothing he could do to help, Johnny hurried into the heart of town to the sheriff's office. Luck was with him, for Sheriff Stryker was in his office when he arrived. Johnny quickly told him about the barbed wire incident with Darrow and Corday and the attack on the herd, resulting in the deaths of several of the Royal Crown's hands. He told him of the ambush on the trail and leaving a wounded King Royal with the doctor. Stryker listened intently, and though he had noticed the fancy gun rig that Johnny now sported, he made no mention of it. "I heard about the incident with the fence," Stryker said after Johnny finished his story. "Darrow and Corday have already been here clamoring for me to do something about it. Darrow claims you are a gunman that King brought in and passed off as his son. He says the 4 men you killed yesterday didn't have a chance against you. Is that right?" "They were about to shoot King. I got them first." "No, son," Stryker clarified. "I mean, are you a gunman masquerading as King's son?" "What do you think?" Johnny answered flatly. "Oh, I think you are King's son, all right," the sheriff said. "But that doesn't mean you're not a gunman, too. That's a mighty fancy rig you got there." He motioned toward the pistol belt. "You weren't sporting that before." "No," Johnny said. "I don't like to wear this, but I do know how to use it when I have to. And trouble has escalated since the last time you saw me." Then he quickly changed the subject. "I came here for your help. If those men who attacked the herd last night are still in town, I want you with me if I find them. I want everything done legal, and if they are still in town, we ought to be getting after them right away." Stryker smiled and stood up from his desk. "You're right." He reached for his hat. "Consider yourself duly deputized. Let's go." The town of Green River seemed to be going about its business as usual for a midweek day. The usual townspeople and business owners bustled about. Wagons from nearby ranches were parked along the street's thoroughfare in front of stores and were being loaded with supplies and other needed goods. A few riders on horseback rode in and out of town casually, but for the most part, traffic was light. Hitch rails in front of the various saloons and entertainment houses were practically empty, since most area cowboys were busy working during the day. As Johnny and Ben Stryker strode down the board sidewalk, they noticed an unusual gathering of horses for this time of day, tied at the hitch rails outside the Golden Calf Saloon. There were 5 horses there, the same number Johnny had been tracking all day. It could just be a coincidence, or perhaps the owners of those horses didn't even ride together. Besides, there should have been only 4 horses, since one of the attackers had stayed behind to ambush them on the trail. Or did he? For all Johnny knew, it could have been someone else. He thought about Luke Thorne for an instant, then forced the thought from his mind. Johnny looked each of the horses over carefully. They all had different brands, but they were all Texas brands. Their coats were all matted and dirty. Their hocks and flanks were coated with mud. Johnny ran a hand over the rump of one of the horses. Red clay stuck to his fingers. He held them out for Stryker to see. The sheriff nodded and hitched his holster a little higher, then stepped up onto the saloon porch and pushed through the batwing doors. Johnny wiped his fingers on the leg of his jeans as he followed him inside. The place was practically empty except for the 5 boisterous men at the bar, their backs to the door as Stryker and Johnny came in. They were all dressed in slovenly range clothes, and they all wore low-hanging pistol belts with guns. The one in the center wore 2 pistol belts buckled across one another. The gun on the left thigh hung butt forward for a cross-draw position. Their laughter and language was harsh, and they slopped their drinks on the bar. The short, rotund bartender with a hairless scalp wiped frantically at the mess without complaints. He looked obviously nervous and distraught. "You men own those muddy horses out there?" Ben Stryker boomed with menace and authority in his voice. The men at the bar suddenly went quiet. They were looking straight ahead at the mirror behind the bar. They could clearly see the 2 men standing behind them and the star on Stryker's vest. They turned slowly to face the lawman. The one in the center had coal-black curly hair that fell beneath the brim of his hat onto a bony forehead. His eyes were dark, and a scar ran along his left cheek. "That's right," he said, smiling broadly and looking past Stryker at Johnny. "What about it?" Johnny was stunned. He knew these men and had ridden with them. This was Pike Grant and his gang.